post the YouTube link to my Facebook so that people can see that.
Where is that link?
When it starts sharing,
okay,
it should say at the top. Okay, it looks like it's live now. All right. Hi, everybody. I think we're ready to get started. This is a town hall on public banking, and I am Councilmember Mary Lupien, representing the East District in Rochester, New York. And I just brought us all here together because public banking is something that I learned about a few years ago that I think is really a kind of an incredible tool to help local municipalities invest in their local communities. And especially in light of COVID and the budget shortfalls, it is especially pertinent to be talking about this in the current time frame. So I just want to begin by reading an acknowledgement of native land. I think it's important to just always keep in our minds that we are on land that was formerly occupied by the indigenous of this nation, and it's important to honor that. So every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will. Some were drawn to leave their distant homes in hope of a better life. Some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. In Rochester, we stand on the ancestral occupied lands of the Haudenosaunee people. We pay respects to their elders past and present. Please take this moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. And please join us in uncovering these truths at any and all public events. So the agenda, we have quite a few really wonderful speakers with us today. Besma Eid from Freedom to Thrive and the Public Bank New York City Coalition, along with Ali Issa from the New Economy Project, and our very own Melissa Marquez from the Genesee Co-op Federal Credit Union. After they give us kind of the intro to public banking, we'll hear from local organizations about how public banking can impact our community locally. Kate Washington of Own Rochester, Joe DiFiore of our Community Roots Land Trust, Ryan Acuff from the Citywide Tenants Union, Pete Nabazi from Reconnect Rochester, and Dave Sutliss, ADS from the Green Party. And then we'll go into QA and next steps. And so just a little Zoom how-to. In the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see a More button where you can find chat and raise your hand. So when it comes to the Q&A section, you can raise your hand and we can kind of call on you. But as the presentation is going on, feel free to put in the chat any comments you have. And if you'd like us to answer any questions and you want to get them out of your mind, you can press the Q&A button at the top. So I'll turn it over to Besma, Ali, and Melissa to give us a Public Banking 101.
Hey everyone, I can just start with a quick introduction to myself, and then Melissa and Ali, if you guys want to also, or if you both want to also quickly introduce yourselves as well. So my name is Besma Eid. I'm a program coordinator with an organization called Freedom to Thrive. So we're a national organization that works to build a definition of safety that goes beyond the idea of prisons, policing, military. And we really work on issues of divestment and reinvestment. And we're also a coalition member of the Public Bank NYC Coalition. don't know if
Hi, I'm Melissa Marcus, and I'm the CEO of Genesee Co-op Federal Credit Union here in Rochester, New York. And our credit union is a member of the Equity Agenda Coalition, as is many of the other organizations, I think, on the call today. One of the platforms of the Equity Agenda Coalition that is a priority for us is public banking. And so through that work at the state level, I've been able to get introduced to and a better understanding of what opportunity public banking could offer to the state of New York, as well as to Rochester, the city of Rochester.
Hello, everybody. My name is Ali Issa. I'm the Public Bank NYC Coalition Coordinator with New Economy Project, which co-founded and convenes Public Bank NYC. Also convenes the Community Equity Agenda Coalition. And yeah, very happy to be with you all today. Kick it back to Besma to talk about what is public banking.
Besma, before you start, I'm so sorry that it slipped my mind to acknowledge my colleagues who are here. Council members Mitch Gruber, Jose Pio, and Jacqueline Ortiz are joining us to learn more about the issue and hopefully have some questions for us at the end. So I just wanted to make sure that I acknowledged it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. So we wanted to jump right in with really just getting into what is public banking. I understand that some folks on this call may be familiar with the concept. A lot of other folks might be less familiar. And simply put, the idea of a public bank, or the way we see the public bank, at least in New York City, is that it's essentially a financial institution that is owned by the public, whether that's a city, a state, another kind, a county, any other type of municipality, for example, and that it's accountable to the people. And so I think we probably all know what a bank is and what a bank does. And so back to basics, a bank's really fundamental job is to accept deposits, make loans, and then profit off of that money. And so on the flip side, what we try to envision through a public bank is that we would have a financial institution that, yes, would accept deposits, public deposits, but as opposed to lending that money to industries, and if you jump to the next slide, actually, we'll kind of get a nice visual of this, but as opposed to lending to really harmful and deplorable industries such as fossil fuels, the real estate industry, at least in terms of like really terrible landlords, private prisons, detention, etc. As opposed to investing in those types of industries, a public bank, which would be accountable to the public, that would be responsible for ensuring public good, could alternatively be investing in things like renewable energy. It could be supporting things like permanently affordable housing, could be supporting financial, credit institutions or other, financial institutions that work towards the people, worker co-ops, et cetera. And so what we've been trying to push in New York City and also across the state is to rethink the way New York does banking. And so currently, at least in New York, New York City, for example, there's an $88 billion budget that every year gets deposited into Wall Street banks, many of which are very same banks that are responsible for foreclosing on homes and for pushing out tenants, to not mention the many other things that we know that Wall Street is responsible for. And so we have an opportunity in New York, but across the state, to demand that public money not be invested in those Wall Street institutions, but rather be invested in something like a public bank. And so currently we don't have a public bank, and that is why we're here. And that's why we've been pushing for this campaign for a long time, and why across the country and actually across the world, there's been a movement for public banking. And I think we can probably jump to the next slide. And I can kick it to Ali, who can talk a little bit about what a public bank could do during a time like the one that we are in right now.
Sure, thank you, Besma. Yeah, and just to zoom back a lot about the Public Bank NYC Coalition. One, I think we want to understand that we're just offering some of our experiences. Having worked on this issue, the campaign in New York City launched about 2.5 years ago. At this point, we have about 35 members of our coalition that are community, labor, environmental, economic justice, small and worker-owned business, and community development financial institutions. So it's a very broad-based coalition, which we're proud of, and I think is integral to how we're seeing the feasibility of this idea. But then also, we understand very clearly that public banking is not a one-size-fits-all. Whether it be across the world, the country, we can talk about North Dakota, the only existing public bank in the country, very different from New York City and Rochester, and that what we're describing as some lessons hopefully are relevant to Rochester, but they're certainly not something just to graft on to your local context. But it's clear too that the COVID-19 pandemic is impacting the state writ large, and that's part of the motivation for our coalition to work at the state level. As mentioned, the community equity agenda this on because it's something that impacts the state as a whole. So I just wanted to briefly mention, you can see here, there's a lot of text in that slide, but how public banking specifically relates to the COVID-19 crisis. Wanted to describe how the Washington Post reported recently that that the Federal Reserve's Main Street lending program, of course, people are more familiar with the PPP. The Post report explained that banks are telling small business owners that they want to offer PPP loans only to existing clients of the bank, which explains part of existing struggles that small and worker-owned businesses are facing around the country and the state, but particularly why public banking is an alternative. Why this recent development in the context of COVID-19 is another warning that we need to address structural barriers that block people, immigrants, people of color from mainstream banking, and that persistent redlining to people of color neighborhoods and high costs of maintaining accounts allow Wall Street to restrict banking access to those communities and perpetuate inequality. So our vision, as we see it for New York City and beyond, is that public banks would partner with community-based lenders, both in New York City, but as we'll describe, and others in Rochester as well, that are focused on those historically redlined neighborhoods and responsible financing, emergency funding to small and worker-owned businesses, especially MWBEs that are hardest hit by the COVID-19 crisis. And public banks would build more broadly resilient communities that support locally rooted economic development initiatives so that there can be that resilience even before a pandemic or a crisis strikes, and kind of serve as a precursor, right? Like if there had been a public bank in New York City or Rochester, we'd be in a much better position in terms of defending those communities and those economic steps. So before passing it to Melissa to talk a little bit more about the local context, just to describe some of we have many local efforts within the City Council of New York, as well as some of the research we've done. We could talk about some of that experience and how it might be relevant to you all. At the state level, we've been working with the state legislature on a bill that would create a regulatory framework for cities, counties, and regions that's establish public banks across the state. At the moment, there's not a charter that is designed for public banking in New York State. So that's why we're discussing with the Senate and the Assembly how DFS, the Department of Financial Services, can authorize a special purpose bank charter to pave the way for public banking. There was a recent example late last year of California passing just such a bill, and knowing that it needs to be flexible, as mentioned. It's not a one size fits all, but there is important regulatory paving that this bill could accomplish. And that's something we're talking with legislators about and that we could discuss collaborating on. So that's just to be continued. We could discuss further, but let me now pass the mic to Melissa to talk about how this idea could implement some of these possibilities locally.
Okay. So, thanks. Yeah, I think I want to, I decided I really wanted to start by kind of backing up and talking really about the philosophical reason why public banking is such an important strategy for the 21st century, especially in terms of addressing racial equity, especially in terms of addressing how to meet the community development needs that so much of the private sector only does in a very limited fashion. So I was watching, there are a number of videos available through YouTube, through the Public Banking Institute, as well as through Public Banking NYC, that people can go online and learn more at your own pace about public banking. But I wanted to, can you go, Mary, to that quote? So I was just really struck by this quote, and I think it's very, very important part of the philosophy behind why public banks are so critical to community development work. So this is from Miguel Santiago. He's an assembly member for the city of Los Angeles in California. And he said, some people say, why do we need a public bank? Let's be clear. Private corporations are not meant to do the business of the public good. And this is, I think just a reality that we really have to, I really encourage everyone to sit with, because the way we've created our system is we're relying on private banking to help meet the needs of doing the business of the public good. By not having public banking recognized and supported at the state level for municipalities, to support municipalities, we've kind of eliminated out of our own history the ability to recycle money at the very local level for the benefit of local municipalities. And that's not to say that banks don't invest, don't do, work at the local level, but they're not the way that the banking system has evolved in the 20th century through merger and acquisitions, so that smaller and smaller institutions, as we all know, banks have left neighborhoods. You just don't have the level of banking infrastructure that was, once seen on Main Street. And so you have these banks that now really serve private client, private clients. So I will go to, when I'm in New York City, I'm always struck by how JP Morgan Chase has all these private client places where only private clients can go in, not the public, not someone who wants to just open an account. But that's a very different banking model than the model of a Main Street bank where, you know, Main Street businesses walked in and knew their local banker and did their banking. And that's not to say that there, you know, I'm not talking about a community bank like Canandaigua National. I'm really talking about the much larger financial institutions that in theory serve or meant to serve the city of Rochester, but don't do it to the extent or the level that's really needed to support the kind of housing development and for affordable housing, as well as business development for very small businesses, as well as, you know, many other needs out of both the not-for-profit sector, as well as for, you know, many small businesses that are really looking for financial capital and don't have access to it. So I really wanted to make sure to make this point that, you know, the private corporations have shareholders, and those shareholders are the ones that they're intended to think, to support or to give back to. They are there to provide the dividends to their shareholders. And because that's their primary mission, to bring back profits for the benefit of the shareholders of the company, even though they were publicly chartered, their business of doing, supporting public good is secondary to what their need to provide the profits to their shareholders. So, and I'm going to illustrate an example of this in that, so JP Morgan Chase, which does hold, you know, a significant amount of deposits for the city of Rochester, they, I was getting numbers from the Greater Rochester Community Reinvestment Coalition, who looks at how banks lend within the city of Rochester. And Barb Van Kerkhove, who I just noticed is on this call, she, you know, I'd cut the numbers and I was taking a look at, these were numbers from 2018 for JP Morgan Chase. And I saw that the number of mortgages provided by JP Morgan Chase within the city of Rochester there were fewer mortgages provided than our own little credit union. So we're a very small financial institution. We're at that time, we were a $23 million credit union. But we are very committed as a community development financial institution to be making mortgages for first-time home buyers, and largely in the city of Rochester, though not exclusively, you know, wherever our members decide they want to live and buy a home and can afford to. But we actually made more mortgages than JP Morgan Chase in the city of Rochester. And I thought to myself, this is a scandal. This is not good if a lender that big, a company that big, who has so much on deposit, the largest deposit holder of money in the Rochester area, is not making loans. They're not making mortgages. They're certainly not making small mortgages, because even though they did make more dollars than we did, they didn't make more numbers. They didn't reach more individual people. And we were a very small institution. And it was, to me, that's like, they don't really do mortgage lending. They aren't committed to mortgage lending within the city of Rochester. They're doing mortgages, but not in the city of Rochester. So that's, again, when our own city is trying to go, how do we have more home ownership within the city of Rochester? How's that going to happen when we have institutions like JP Morgan Chase not making mortgages in low income and moderate income, and just plain within the city of Rochester, unless they're very high, bigger amounts of mortgages. So that to me is an example of where if we are relying solely on a private banking model, we're not going to get what is truly needed strategically with for the benefit of more people within the city. So we don't have scale. And the public banking model is one that would provide that level of scale that it would be needed, that just the city budget alone, and you could go on to the next screen, Mary. So, you know, I'm kind of stepping ahead of myself, but the city budget alone is, you know, 555, this year's, I think, was $556 million. And that's just the city, not the school district itself's budget. But, you know, as an example, in a public banking model where the money that the city has is placed within the public bank, that money is then utilized for making loans not to individuals. Generally, it's not developed as a model for making, for having individual depositors and individual borrowers. It's really meant to support both the work of the city and to save the city or the municipality's money, as well as to provide lending or support or participation loans to other entities or organizations that are doing development work within the municipality. And so I was just really struck that I was just curious, and I was like, how much of the budget, the 2021 city budget, was used for debt service? And so, you know, I saw a chart within the budget and it said 6%. And of the, can you click one more time, Mary? So, and I guess, can you, I don't know, can you move the screen up slightly? Oh no, maybe people can see it. I just can't see it. But of that 556 million, you know, that the amount of debt service just for the 1 year, and we're not talking, you know, there's larger amounts of debt, which city council members would be very well aware of, that come, you know, are for long-term infrastructure projects that really could benefit from a public bank that is going to be at the lowest cost than what would otherwise be offered. And so that's one of the great benefits of a public bank, you know, role within a municipality. I think the other thing that I'm just going to mention is that, you know, in the case of the credit union, so while we, you know, are serving individual members who join us from, you know, the city, predominantly from the city of Rochester, become members of our credit union and borrow from us. If we got to a point where most of our money is all lent out and we're doing long-term fixed rate mortgages, because those are the best kinds of mortgages for borrowers. I mean, we try to get them into 15-year mortgages if it's affordable, because it's more beneficial to the homeowner. But many homeowners choose to go with a 30-year long-term fixed rate mortgage. And at some point that money would be all used up, and we would not be able to continue to necessarily lend. We'd have to borrow in order to lend. In the role that a public bank offers then is to take on some of that debt and really can serve and act as a secondary market to local financial institutions who would be looking for additional liquidity to lend out to individuals. So, you know, I guess I think I want to just stop for a minute, because I know I've been talking for quite a while. And, you know, I want to turn it back. I don't know if Ali or Basma wants to add to what I've just been talking about as to ways that public banking can be beneficial at the municipal level. Are either of them there?
Sure. This is Ali. Thank you so much, Melissa. That was, I think, much more than I can say with respect to Rochester, and I very much appreciate that. I think all that I can think of it to add is that in New York City, we have had a very much a similar approach with an understanding that Wall Street banking does not serve communities, it doesn't serve the city, and we're kind of locked and trapped in this relationship. In our case, by law, and this is some of the lesson too. We have a banking commission where every year they decide which banks can deal with New York City's budget. It's a list of 30 banks. Basically, it's the big four: Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, Citi, and Wells Fargo is trying to come back. They have a great rating now, so they can return to that status. And those are the same banks that are denying, as you've said, access as well as destroying the planet. So it's not just a matter of divesting, but then how can you divest in a way which would create a viable alternative and invest very concretely in the things that you're describing communities need. So that's the model. It's divestment with a concrete alternative that's been proven elsewhere, and that there's a clear, I think, motivation to see public banking as a local, driven like Genesee Co-op, like other kind of institutions. Community land trusts are a way to address displacement, and that North Dakota has provided, with the only public bank existing right now, a lot of these PPP loans, and they've been celebrated even in the mainstream press as a bulwark for the current pandemic. But that's, I think, only the tip of the iceberg. Like, if we're able to understand public banking in our own local context, you can go much further and provide that kind of economic alternative. I think that clearly we feel like we need. So, yeah, that's what I would just say. I mean, Melissa laid it out very clearly, and maybe want to add anything.
I think I don't have much to add. I think we're tight on time, but I think just underpinning that point around like the accountability that you mentioned, Melissa, right? So Chase is, they're accountable to their private clients and their board and all of these kind of puppeteers of the financial institution, whereas a public bank, in the way that, the co-ops as well, are accountable to their members. And so a public bank really being accountable to the public is so important. And not only being accountable, but exactly like Ali is saying, that the public bank would be driven by a mission that's charged for promoting the public good and really like thinking about how do we keep people in homes? How do we create an avenue for folks to actually, not have to go through all of the like hoops just to get a mortgage and a mortgage at like a rate that people can afford. And so I think that that's kind of like, one of the most important pieces around public banking. But I think we're gonna turn it over to Kate. So.
Yeah, Kate has to leave us a little early, so I just want to make sure that we had time to hear from her. Kate is CEO of Own Rochester, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. One of the first things I want to say is, first of all, thank you for hosting this, because I think this is really important, especially now. And I really absolutely support and believe in the public banking bill that's currently in front of the legislature, because it provides access to capital to people who in the past have really not had access. And I'd like to talk about from the perspective of Own Rochester. I'm going to actually address it from two perspectives right now. I want to start, first of all, by talking about the workers who are currently in our organization, many of whom have had significant distrust of the financial institution to begin with. In many cases, they have had issues with financial institutions that have done some of the things we've seen during COVID-19, where people have come in and made suits against them, taken funds out of their accounts. And these are already people who are extremely volatile and vulnerable based on their past financial histories, family histories, lived experiences in poverty, incarceration, a whole host of issues. So the financial institutions have really not really served well, in many cases, some of the workers that we currently work with. And one of the reasons I support the public bank is because I believe it provides them an opportunity to have a banking system that really supports their needs and also has an understanding of the challenges that they face, rather than very much like Melissa said, what you saw in all of the larger banks and their absolute drive and need to serve shareholder value. In this case, we're looking at people who are in many cases just experiencing banking. And I'll give you an example. We actually have 2 employees in our business right now, neither of whom even had bank accounts. They were working, keeping the money that they were earning with us underneath their mattresses, and very, very reluctant to even engage in the financial institution at all. These are the people we always refer to as unbankable. They're unbankable because they had such a distrust of what the banking systems have done to them in the past. So over time, we've been able to talk with them and educate them and give them access to information. And they've moved now from being unbankable to having access to banks, having access to things like the ability to buy a car and that kind of thing. But that was over a 2-year period that it took to get to that place. If we had a public bank that really had their back and that they could really, really depend on to really serve their needs, I think that would have been a much shorter time frame. And I think it would have benefited them greatly to be able to have savings accounts that were generating interest. So from a personal and individual standpoint, I believe public banking, which can be accountable to people and residents of a community, is something that could be of real value here in Rochester. From an organizational standpoint, I also believe in that, because realistically, worker-owned businesses are in many cases a foreign concept to traditional banks. Let's just put it that way. They have a difficult time supporting the mission of these organizations. They don't understand them. And in some cases, they are almost even threatened by them. I can think about the number of worker-owned businesses that actually tried to get funding to support their operations during the pandemic and were turned away. And many of the workers in those businesses now are suffering even more severely, because they were already in a worker-owned position where they were generating money for their families, able to sustain themselves. As soon as the pandemic hit and they were put out of work, they did not have access to things like the Paycheck Protection Program. They did not have access to a lot of the funding that's available to other traditional businesses. And I believe public banking has a greater understanding of these types of businesses, especially worker-owned businesses, and can really meet those needs in a substantial way. So I completely support it. I want to give you a little example. In our organization, we actually had a line of credit with one of the local banks, and we were working very well with them. And I actually approached them to see if they, through any of their CRA funding, could support our ability to pay down that line of credit and still maintain a positive standing with the bank. Well, they interpreted that as we were trying to default on the loan. We were not trying to default on the loan. We were just looking for options, and they didn't understand the option that would be applicable to a 501c3 organization or an organization that provides a community service. So they were not able to even consider that. And I think in a public banking situation, we would have fared much better. We were able to really manage and pay off the loan, and there was no hard feelings. But I think that just the misunderstanding and the inability to really look at this as a public service was something that would have been of real value to us. The other thing I want to talk about is that when we think about people who are vulnerable, particularly businesses that are in our communities, in what I consider to be the lower income communities, a lot of those smaller businesses are owned by people of color. You've got a large number of small Black-owned businesses, Latinx-owned businesses. Not all those businesses have employees. And for them, getting access to capital to grow those businesses and to actually create a thriving community or a neighborhood in which they're existing is very, very difficult. I think a public bank can serve the needs of these communities in a way that currently private banks have not been able to do. So I completely support this, and I see great opportunity for a public bank in our community.
Thank you so much, Kate. Next up is Joe DiFiore of City Roots Land Trust.
All right, so, wow, the panelists I think so far have done a really good job of making the case for it. I hope I can add to it a bit. Yeah, so the Community Land Trust, a big part of what we deal in is affordable housing through community land ownership. And I just want to reinforce some of the points that some of the other panelists have made around where I see it directly benefiting the Community Land Trust. But before I do that, I guess I just want to say how this is one of those things for me where it's so obvious that we should be doing this that it's kind of almost difficult to know where to begin in explaining just why we should do it, right? The fact that we have this public money, taxpayer funds, and the concept that we should be using it for the public good, and that it should be, reinvested in the community where the taxes are coming from, seems really, really obvious. So just the fact that we're not doing it already is almost surprising. And I really hope to see us getting there sooner rather than later. For the Community Land Trust specifically, we have one of the things we deal in and things Melissa touched on, for instance, with securing lower mortgages is something we deal with a lot with people because we're city focused. We want people, our membership to be part of the city. That's where we have our presence. And a lot of the mortgages in the city are lower end mortgages compared to what a lot of the banks are doing, right? So we're not dealing in houses that are going to be selling for $200,000, $300,000, $500,000. We're more in the range of $60,000, $50,000. And not all financial institutions are really interested in doing that. And some of them have been pressured into doing them more often. But we also have the added layer of the Community Land Trust model, right? And there's not a lot of incentive for private financial institutions that are national or international organizations to take the time to learn about what a community land trust is and what that sort of mortgage product might entail. So we're working with great partners like the Genesee Co-op Federal Credit Union, which is awesome. But as Melissa said, that's a credit union, a financial institution with limited scale. So really, to bring our organization to scale, we need the funds that an institution like a public bank could provide to help partner with an organization like the credit union, the Genesee Credit Union, or one of the other local credit unions, to really help enable those loans to our organization for development that we want to do, and to our members that want to secure mortgages at good interest rates for affordable houses. We also partner with the Rochester Citywide Tenant Union. And one of the things that we're really interested in doing is facilitating a tenant buyout of an apartment building. We're in a derelict landlord, isn't maintaining the building, is just being a slumlord. And through organizing with the tenant union, getting to a point where those tenants could form an organization that would purchase the building. Well, they need financing to do that, right? And we need a financial institution that recognizes both the appeal and the necessity, and if I could throw it in there, kind of the moral righteousness of allowing for that option. And when you have a public bank, a public and local institution, you're able to exert that influence much more readily through a mandate to serve the public good. Right? And that's really what it comes down to is when we have these organizations like Own Rock doing worker co-ops, when we're doing tenant organizing of buildings, trying to give them opportunity to take ownership of their building, when we're doing permanent affordability and housing, and on, kind of these innovative things that can take us in a new and better direction for our economic future and build a better, more equitable society. In my mind, it really takes a partner in a financial institution, and this public banking option presents the perfect opportunity for that partnership. So with that, I'll hand it off to the next person.
Thanks so much, Joe. Next is aptly Ryan Acuff from the Citywide Tenant Union.
Hi, I'm Ryan from the Tenant Union, and I just want to agree with what Joe was saying, but we organize tenants for tenant power and better conditions and better affordability. But really, the way to get to better conditions, better affordability is through tenant control, through some of the programs like Joe's talking about. And I think for us, the way we see it is that, it's hard to understate the catastrophic housing conditions that do exist in Rochester, whether it's the shortage of 28,000 units of affordable housing for people living in poverty, to 0 to 30 AMI, according to some of these reports put out by the National Low Income Housing Coalition, whether it's 1 out of every 4 people who move every single year in Rochester. And then, the racialized aspect of eviction and displacement, where on average, Black families paying 55% of their income on rent, a Latino's family paying on average 45% of their income on rent, and a white family is paying on average 35% of their income on rent. So we have these very, very serious conditions. And I think a lot of what is happening is because of the main financial system is this for-profit banking system, which creates all these incredibly perverse incentives. And there's an old saying about, if you don't understand what's going on, you got to follow the money. And if you see how certain neighborhoods are disinvested, you got to follow the money, right? And you see how different neighborhoods are being gentrified and displacing the long-term working class and low-income folks. You follow the money, and that money is coming from the banks. And we would be the first to identify a list of horrible slumlords or landlords pricing people out. And we can pass policies and protections to limit some of these most horrible practices. But even the landlords are being driven and financed by this financial system, this for-profit system that's creating and buttressing and up this system. So when we say, well, why are 2/3 of city residents tenants? That is long-term racist housing policy and finance policy that the tenant class is that big, and that they are being treated the way they are. And even if redlining is officially illegal, I see people here in this program that have Empire Justice that have continue to put out reports on how communities of color continue to be starved of credit and opportunities. And the redlining continues in the city in very drastic ways. So denying people the opportunity to have control over their housing, and then really financing, strategy of displacement and slum conditions. So I think that's exactly what we want, is the opposite. So mission-driven finance that's community controlled through public and community controlled finance that is really focused on the needs, and not, as people have talked about, just people who are trying to make money in which may or may not be aligned with people's needs. As Joe talked about, one of the key policies we're advocating for as tenant union is the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, something existed for 40 years in Washington, D.C., where every time a building goes up for sale, the tenants have the first right to purchase. And whether it's a single family home and become homeowners of the building they've been paying into, or a multifamily housing where tenants can buy and, if they choose, become a cooperative and keep the housing permanently affordable. And there are enough financial tools to get a program like this off the ground in the city and create more housing stability, more equity, and begin to reverse some of these horrible racist housing policies. But to take something like this to scale and impact, we have to not only follow the money how we get there, but we have to find the money and generate the money. And public banking is one of the ways out. It gives us a chance out to think about how could we actually create housing as a right, because it's going to cost money. So we're going to have to drive down the costs, which for-profit banks, high interest rates and different practices drive up the costs, but we're also going to generate revenue based on that. And I think public banking is going to be one of the most essential strategies to take any effective housing policy to scale. And this is something we really have to figure out how to do on a local level, the state level, and all levels, because there's just so much on the line on all levels, but certainly with our housing and as our housing stability as a foundation will need to meet all of our other needs. So I'm just really glad that we're talking about this. We're educating ourselves together, and I hope we can take action together to really make this a reality, because this is what we're going to need, is a really strong, mission-driven municipal bank. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Pete Nabozny is from Reconnect Rochester, and he's going to talk about how it can impact transportation.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Let me take part in this discussion here. You can kind of see it on the screen there, but Reconnect Rochester, we're a volunteer-led organization here in Rochester that pushes for improvements to our community's public transportation infrastructure, trying to ensure that people can get around in this community without needing ownership of a car, and that access to our broad community is available to anyone, regardless of their income level and again, ability to bear the high costs of owning a vehicle. There's been a lot of talk about housing, which is obviously an incredibly critical issue. It's also important to recognize more than a quarter of households in the city of Rochester don't own an automobile, don't have access to an automobile. Many more households have far fewer automobiles than they do adults who need them for different reasons. And so having a robust public transportation system is really critical to a lot of those challenges that we face as a community, a lot of the opportunities we want to ensure that everyone has access to. So whether it's jobs or healthcare services, or being able to access educational opportunities, job training programs, or just being able to take advantage of recreational activities that we have in this community, we need to have a vibrant public transportation system. We also need to have a community that is friendly to walking and to cycling and all different modes of travel. And that's an area where we struggle as a community because in a lot of ways we're dependent on the funding that's available to the Public Transportation Authority here. There are certainly things that RTS can do better in terms of ensuring that people have access to all parts of our community, but the reality is their budget is largely not set by them. They receive a set amount of federal aid, they receive a set amount of state aid, they receive a fixed amount of financing from counties in our region that hasn't gone up since the mid-90s. And they are, I think, quite appropriately conscientious of the fact that if they raise fares, they are pricing people out of riding the bus. And so we've got a real challenge there at ensuring there's adequate resources for our public transportation system. And that's why you see so few bus stops in our community that have shelters. The environment here a lot of the year is pretty harsh. And yet we expect people to stand outside waiting for very long periods of time unsheltered to get on the bus. This is all a way of saying that what I want to focus on as part of this conversation, because everyone else has touched on all the other great points, is the fact that while a public bank would not be profit driven. It would be mission driven, right? We'd want it to invest in the community, not be a profit maximizing vehicle. The reality is, if it does generate profits, unlike a private bank or even unlike a credit union, that those profits can be reinvested in the community in various ways. So the Bank of North Dakota is kind of the most prominent public bank. It's really the only public bank that's really operating this way. And it's been around for over 100 years. I was checking out its financial statements earlier today because that's the kind of thing I do. And it generates about $100 million of profit each year that's turned over to the state's coffers for use on various state initiatives. Sometimes they don't access all that funding. Sometimes they draw down more, but that's a lot of money. And you're like, oh, well, that's a state. Well, North Dakota has the population about of Monroe County. It's a pretty sparsely populated state. And so and obviously that public bank has been around for 100 years. It has a lot of institutional strengths. And I don't think it'd be realistic to expect that a public bank in Rochester, if established next year, would be generating those kinds of profits right away. But the underlying idea is that as these banking institutions do generate some amount of additional resources, it's going towards these investments in the public good, things like public transportation, things like we had a bike share program in Rochester. It is not here now because of a variety of issues. But one of those challenges we had setting it up was we had to find sponsorship for where those bike stations would go around the city. And because of a lack of identified resources to support that bike share program, the parts of the city that have businesses that have the resources to sponsor it are not necessarily the places where the community can most benefit from having access to a bike share. And so you had the more affluent parts of the southeast quadrant of the city that businesses wanted to have bike share in that part of the community. But you had a lot of other parts of the city that they don't have the resources to generate I think it was $9,000 for that bike station to get set up. And so you've got big equity issues there that came into play. Well, having some of these resources from a public bank that are dedicated to investments in the public good that would be identified, not just transportation. I think housing is another key area. I think there's a lot of things we should be talking about, but having these stated priorities of what we would do as a community with the proceeds of this, that's a really powerful thing to be able to identify those priorities and then fund them as these investments come back and as the bank does turn whatever kind of modest profit that it may. And so I think this is a great example of how we need to sort of change our thinking on how to invest in this community and find resources for things in this community. In a lot of areas, because of various laws that have changed and I think a perception of financial scarcity, so much of the conversations about getting funding in this community boil down to, well, we need to go to Albany and get more state funding for something now. And the reality is this community is not as wealthy as Westchester County. It's not as wealthy as Long Island or of Manhattan or many other places, but there is a lot of wealth in this community. And if we can be creative in finding ways to identify that wealth and ensure that it stays within the community and can be reinvested in the community, we'd see a lot more of these public goods that people are talking about that could benefit everyone in this community, with a particular focus on those folks who lack certain financial resources to access these things on their own. So transportation is one example of that, but I think there's a lot of other areas that we could be thinking about. And the idea of a public bank is really attractive at kind of kicking those ideas in gear and allowing us to reimagine how we're supporting everyone in this community and those needs that the entire community has. Thank you.
Pete, that was great. Thank you so much. Last of our speakers, but certainly not least, is David Sutliff-Adius. He's with the Green Party of Monroe County, and he's going to talk to us about how public banking could impact green infrastructure.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I really appreciate the participation. I am going to talk about public banking and green infrastructure, but I'm going to get there in a roundabout kind of way. one of the things that I really like to hammer home when we talk about public banking is the opportunity to democratize our local financial system. Now, I hope no one's going to call for, if we end up with a public bank, that where everybody's voting on mortgages that are granted and things like that. That's not what, in this case, what democratizing our financial system means. But we have more say in how our public money is spent, whether that's through elections or people serving on boards, or even having just community meetings where input's taken. Chase is not going to be doing that. Wells Fargo is not going to be doing that. And this is a brilliant opportunity to be able to, for us to have more say in how our public money is spent. Also, we can be as creative as we want with this. Now, I know there's new legislation that would make it much easier to start public banking, and I just found out about it right before this this get together, so I haven't read it yet. But I'll say this: if there's anything in there that prohibits or slows us down to be able to do the really creative things that we want to do and that we need to do, then we can change that if we organize and we do that together, because all of this system is made by humans, mostly men, mostly white men, but made by humans. And because it's not anything that's set in stone, we can always change it if we organize and work together. If we want to have a public bank that does certain things that folks in Albany or wherever aren't really into, again, organizing and making our voice heard and making it happen. And that's not just citizens, that includes the public leaders who are on the Zoom meeting as well as those who aren't. And so there's amazing opportunities to do things that includes green infrastructure, and I'm getting there, I promise. Something that Kate was talking about, that when I know Greens in the past have talked about using public money to support cooperative businesses or worker-owned businesses. She gave an example of someone who she's working with now. We've advocated that we can use this public money to create a startup cost for more worker-owned businesses. And for those who have studied this, worker-owned businesses deal with issues like COVID or other economic hardships better than traditional type businesses. And so when we put our public money into things that survive economic hardships, we're actually attacking poverty in Rochester and more than one front. And so that's why advocating and getting a public banking in this area is really that important, and it's that crucial that we do this. So okay, let me get to some green infrastructure. There's standalone things we could definitely do. Let me do one of the ones that's most outrageous, that some people think it's an awesome idea and some people are just totally dead set against. But we could use public financing to finally put windmills in Lake Ontario. And it's totally possible. And actually, green candidates have run on this and how it can be done just within using city money on city property. But that's one way to create energy, using public money to do that. And with the movement right now that's working towards democratizing our utilities, that also has a double effect on both democracy in our city as well as green infrastructure and public money. Another thing, and speaking with transportation, so when I ran for city council last year, I just did an informal poll on what people thought about our public transportation system. And price wasn't an issue. It wasn't so much the cost. It really was about there weren't enough buses running. And I get it. The scale of how many people, first of all, are in Monroe County, are in the city, and they use public transportation, putting more buses on the road isn't cost feasible. But when we have public money, and if we decide we want it earmarked for that, we could flood our streets with, I'm going to say, electric buses, which we would also need help with the infrastructure for the charging of the buses. So that's even helping our environment even more. And if we flood our streets with buses so that so there's always one running in everybody's neighborhood, that will reduce traffic, thus reducing even more pollution and hopefully wear and tear on our roads. And it's just really win-win altogether. And let's see. And then we can do something that's really kind of no kidding, just work on, I know we won't get to 100%, but public money can also work to put solar on everybody's roof. The couple years I was teaching in Hawaii, they had just passed a law, at least in the county of Maui, where every new home built had to have solar, at least for hot water heaters. And I know it's Maui, sunshine and all that jazz, but I'm just giving that as an example of something that we can do in a way to pay for that using public money and public banking and financing. And then to what I think, if I remember the agenda right, I think I'm unconsciously or consciously going to transition to the next thing. So it's really important to do this. We're going to need a heavy lift here to make this happen at the state level. That bill that I'm going to go read tonight is a great idea, and that's a great start. But once that gets passed, then we also need to advocate to have our public banking be the way we want it to be, to do the things that we want it to do. And that's going to take, yes, our elected leaders to get on board, but it's going to take the entire community to advocate and say what they want and how they want this to work. And of course, those who know me, I could do this all night, and I'm going to stop now because I do have other ideas we could use public money for. But it's really going to be important to, once we get through with this Zoom meeting, that there's going to be action to be taken, not only getting that bill passed, which I'm assuming it has some good stuff to it, but also doing the work to make it happen here locally as well. Thanks.
Thanks, David, for those ideas. It's great. So we've heard a lot about how public banking can really impact our community locally. I want to circle back to the state legislation that's been mentioned a few times. Ali or Besma, if you want to talk about this a little bit more briefly before we step into Q&A.
Sure, thank you, Mary. Yeah, I'd be happy to. So yeah, as people have mentioned, both Public Bank NYC and the Equity Agenda Coalition, which is statewide, have been discussing public banking and engaging the state legislature about a way to make it easier, right? It's also a way to raise the issue across the state for the reasons we've all talked about. To establish public banks, right, in Rochester, in New York City, in Long Island, and elsewhere. But I think, yeah, we're currently in discussion, you know, with leadership in the Banks Committee on the Senate side and the Assembly as well. So I think what I want to emphasize is how the Public Bank NYC Coalition and Equity Agenda as well has been trying to make sure that the bill that we're pushing for aligns with those particular values, right? Is going to champion these visions that you described for Rochester, is generally going to be a bank aligned with our social justice mission, and also accountable to community, right? And able to achieve these large aims that we so clearly see are necessary. So yeah, it's an ongoing conversation, and we can update everybody here on this call and the coalition emerging in Rochester about how those conversations are emerging. But at the moment, yeah, I think this is our general, this slide here, our approach where we want a regulatory framework which will make it easier, and then yeah, the ability to use that, right, as a vehicle and a platform to do what we want to do locally. So yeah, just that's a small comment, and we can discuss more about strategy and tactics, I think, in the Q&A and in an ongoing conversation.
Thank you. So I just wanted to mention before we go into Q&A that there is a newly formed Rochester Banking Coalition, brand new. So a few of the panelists on the call are part of that, and you can check it out on the Facebook page, Rochester Banking Coalition. The website is listed there. It is not up yet, but it will be. So this is really a brand new effort in Rochester to kind of bring together all of the different aspects of public banking into a coalition and to really build some power and education around the topic. So I thank you all for being here and for participating in the conversation. Thank you, Vesma, for sticking that in the chat. So there's a couple of questions that people asked in the Q&A box. So we'll go through those and then kind of open it up if folks want to ask questions. So Joel Elliott asks, how do CDBG funds dovetail into this opportunity? And I'll kind of open it up to any of the panelists that want to take a stab at that question.
This is Melissa. What I can say is because CDBG funds flow through the city of Rochester, for receipt of those funds and then the disbursement, those funds would be a part of the public bank because that money would be invested, deposited into a public bank in Rochester. So it'd be great. And I think I just want to add to that, one of the opportunities that public banks also offer, and I didn't really get a chance to go into it, but there's not enough time to really delve deeper into it, but it's around how risk is assessed and at a very local level, where there is the democratization of decision making, that risk and categorizing and assessment of risk can really be upended from the traditional way that private banking assesses risk. And so that's another really important aspects of public banking as a strategy at the municipal level for community development and racial equity work.
Thank you. Carl Berger asked about, in regards to the advantages of a public bank during the COVID-19 response, are there existing cases in other cities, states, or countries of public banks being leveraged in a crisis like this or this crisis? I know someone's going to talk about the 2008 crisis and the Bank of North Dakota, but I'll open that up to anyone that wants to answer. Looks like Pete's got his hand up.
I'll post something in the chat, but there was a really good article in the Washington Post maybe a month ago about how the Bank of North Dakota played that role for a lot of smaller banks in that state. And I mean, there are certainly some problems as were mentioned earlier with PPP loans and things like that, but North Dakota, at least for the first round of the PPP loans, they had the highest uptake of any state in the country in terms of small businesses getting access to those loans. And I think the article makes a pretty compelling case that it was largely due to the role that public bank plays as a resource, as a convener, as someone who's not dedicated to sort of like maximizing fee collection through that process, but was really able to play that role in supporting small businesses throughout that state. So I'll post that in the chat, but I think it's a really good kind of breakdown of what a public bank can do in a sort of crisis situation like that.
Yeah, thank you. And for those watching on YouTube, I will post that in the comments. Anybody else have something to add to that? All right.
I mean, I guess I could add just in the sense that, obviously we're in this moment that it feels like a particular heightened crisis, but like we've always been in crisis. Like the pandemic has only exacerbated the crisis of capitalism and the way capitalism has been impacting like all of our communities. And so I think that like looking to examples, North Dakota or otherwise, I mean, I think we'll probably talk about some work that's happening in California and also internationally in other countries across the world where public banking has existed also for quite a while, and you can kind of see the impact like locally. I think just to sort of say that there's so much potential with public banking when it comes to, that like Kaz has mentioned, whether it's around green infrastructure, transportation, housing. And so I think that all of those pieces could be, benefiting a lot of people and could address a lot of the crises that we've been living with, not only in 2020, but for a while, So I just wanted to kind of throw that in there in my general pro public banking spiel. But
yeah, and just to kind of what Melissa was saying about the CDBG funds being deposits, during COVID, we've received millions of extra dollars in aid, and that would also be deposited in the bank. And so it's just another way that it would help out in that crisis.
Can I just want to, reiterate or just really emphasize that when there is an economic, crisis like the one that we are facing with the level of recession, the potential for a depression, banks, financial institutions of private banks retrench. They become risk averse. They don't want to take risks in the way that communities right at the moment of a crisis most need it. They're not going to be there to do that, which to me is one of the main reasons why public banking as a strategy becomes so much more essential, just for the survival of, Main Street, ordinary citizens, whether in Rochester or across New York State or globally. It's really important, essential.
Definitely. And Wall Street's response is often austerity, and austerity does not benefit anyone on Main Street or any other street that's not Wall Street. So, yeah.
Next question, I'll kind of combine two questions because I think they're related. One, Kristen French asks, is there a main common theme among those that are skeptical towards public banking that are easy to refute? Or is there something that's more difficult to refute? And then are big banks against this? I think I know the answer to that one.
I don't know if, I'm happy to give other folks a chance. I mean, I think one of the themes that does, will arise that is kind of used against public banking is this notion that how do you prevent corruption or graft that would happen at the local level, that somehow a public bank is going to be dragged into basically corrupt practices, right? So and then for me, the reason I feel like it's easy to refute is I'm like, look around at the private corporations and the level of corruption or horrible policies hurting ordinary citizens. Wells Fargo creating fake bank accounts. That's it's really just used to try to detract. But the reality is that public banking, because it's going to be at such a local level of a municipality, and it calls citizens into the process of controlling money that is really coming from the citizenry. There you can put the accountability in place at a local level that is virtually impossible with transnational financial institutions.
Yeah, I feel like so many of you made so many great arguments that are hard to refute. I mean, having local control over our public money, being able to use that public money to invest in our community. Kristen, if you want to follow up on that question, if we didn't quite answer it, I can allow you to talk if you would like. Because I think it's important when thinking about talking about this to other people to really have in mind, like, what are the things that people can kind of come back at you at? Really what I found is just, it's a lack of knowledge. What I end up talking mostly about is, is this a credit union? Is this an amalgamated bank? You know, how is this different? Is it the kind of bank that's going to go in the post offices? So it's really, I feel like, a knowledge gap. But once people understand what it is, I don't know what the arguments against it are, other than if you're the CEO of a big bank. Let's see. Joel Elliott asks, how many public banks are there in the US? Easy, one. The Bank of North Dakota is a state bank, and it's like Pete said, it's been around for, I forget, 18 something. It's been around for a while, but there are lots of examples in other countries. And I don't know off the top of my head any to list. If anybody else has some that they can list for people to look up, but you know, you can find it on Google. Costa Rica, thank you.
Yeah, this is Ali. Just to add to that, yeah, I mean, Costa Rica is an interesting model because they do have, as far as we understand, like some of the most clear and strong community accountability mechanisms for their public bank. There's some worker-owned businesses that contribute directly to it. And then, yeah, there's some, like Melissa was saying, how do we institute safeguards and an advisory board, for example, which would keep the mission of the public bank. And I myself, I got to visit the Sparkassen, which is like one of the most important German public banks.
All right.
So, so yeah, there's a lot to say about that, but I was just lucky to meet a person who was actually engaged in training the advisory board. So there would be a union involved in overseeing the investment priorities of the Sparkassen in Berlin, where I was, or there would be also, you know, a particular credit union equivalent in the Berlin context to to also maintain those investment priorities. So yeah, Germany offered an interesting model, and I think the dialogue with existing examples we could draw from, because internationally it is far more acceptable, successful. There's some historical models we could learn from. So yeah, North Dakota, yeah, it's one thing. North Dakota is really exceptional. Like, you're not going to really have a North Dakota scenario in much of the country, but we can also point to very clear parallels across the world. And I could, of course, share some of those lessons, but maybe we should have a Rochester delegation to Berlin. I don't know if anybody's interested.
The next question is from Jane Morgan. Do we need a bill in the state Senate to form the public bank in Rochester? I think that's a really good question. I'll throw it to you guys to answer. My understanding is that we don't need it, but it would make it a whole lot easier. Anybody else wants to expand on that?
Oh, sorry, I had to speak again. This is Ali. Yeah, I mean, but in our New York City coalition, that's our understanding as well. The existing state law doesn't require any concrete change. Cities, regions, municipalities can form their own public banks right now, but it would ease the path, right? Like, there would be a specific charter form and regulatory framework that would help and symbolically encourage the idea. So yeah, not necessary, but helpful. I think that's how we've been approaching the state level legislation in New York City, at least.
Thank you. So we have a question that asks about existing public banks. So, you know, being that there's, you know, only one in the country, there's some examples overseas. We'll try to answer this, but do they tend to charge overdraft fees? It seems backwards to penalize people for not having money by driving them further into debt, rather than just denying a charge or withdrawal in the first place. So, you know, public banks can have personal accounts, but I think that many don't. I'm going to get out of my depth here, but that it's really about investing in the community, and partnering with institutions like the Genesee Credit Union to allow them to be able to reach more folks on that personal banking level. Melissa, do you want to contribute to that one?
I mean, to the extent, really, I mean, I was curious. I was like, well, I guess we'd have to go and look to see what does the North Dakota Bank, State Bank have by way of disclosing what kind of fee structure that they would have, right? But I would imagine, because they're really built towards, they not serving private individuals, they're not going to have that level of overdraft fees that really the private banking system is making, bundles and bundles, billions, multi-billions of dollars just in their fee system, in a way that, because of the way electronic banking has evolved in the United States, it just has made it tremendously lucrative for the private corporations to, rake in so much more money, separate individuals from so much money, and create a crisis for so many people because of the level of fees being charged due to the electronic payment system that they've developed for the benefit of the private, banking system.
Mary?
David.
Yeah, well, this isn't directly related to fees, but about private accounts. One of the things that I've advocated for is a system that's done in small pockets in different places around the country, but I would like to see really expanded here. And using a public bank to do that is something called children's savings accounts, whereas children born into poverty in the city of Rochester are automatically giving a savings account with X amount of dollars, 50, 100, whatever, that's a negotiable amount. And the public bank would manage that, which can be put into throughout the child's actually lifetime. But once they turn 18, that money, particularly the money that's given by a municipality, would need to be used for something that's wealth building, whether it's education, buying a home, or starting a business. That would be a type of private account that I would like to see a public bank in Rochester do, something like that.
It's a really interesting concept. Thanks. So I noticed that we're at the 7:30 mark, and we actually did make it through all of our Q&A questions that were in the box. I just put in the chat, if anyone has any questions, you can put them in the chat and we'll post answers afterwards, or even just reach out to any one of us. I want to thank everyone so much for being here. This was incredibly informative. This is a dense topic, and it's different from what we understand banking to be. And even me, who I've been learning about this for at least a year, I still sometimes think that I have it, and then I'm misunderstanding something. So that's why I really wanted to bring this together to kind of, there's already some knowledge in the community to really continue the process of educating us on what this could mean for Rochester. And I think all of our panelists made an excellent case for it. So I just want to go into next steps. So please follow Rochester Public Banking Coalition on Facebook. It is very empty right now, but we are going to be filling that up. With the state legislation, the legislature is out right now, but we'd like to build some power to mobilize and maybe do some legislative visits in the fall. And then just continue to build our coalition and grow knowledge in Rochester. So if you would like to be a part of that, please reach out to us and let me know. Because you know, we'd like to host more events and really bring more people into the movement. And lastly, spread the word. If you liked what you heard here and want to tell somebody about it, you know where to point them. And this will be on YouTube, so anyone can view this later on. I had quite a lot of people tell me that they were very interested but couldn't be on tonight. So I'm excited that this will live on. So thank you to everyone. And yes, Basma actually put in the chat box too. I'm so sorry that I didn't plug your movement, but
No, all good, all good. I just liked the Rochester page on Facebook, so
Yay.
12 followers. Here we go.
So their Twitter is Public Bank NYC, and they're always posting great stuff on there. If you want to learn more about it and kind of follow the work that they're doing in New York City and on the state level. So thanks everybody. Enjoy your night. Stay cool. It's like 100 degrees. All right, take care.
Thank you.
Mary.
Thank you, Mary.
Good night, everybody.
Everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Right.